Hey everybody, my name is Dan Marino, and today I'm going to show you how to use Cinema 4D's built-in tools to create some really cool comic book style shaders. Before we get started, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Chad Ashley for his tutorial on making a Spider-Man texture in Arnold, and also his new CMYK tutorial also in Arnold. So if you use Arnold, make sure to check these out. Some really cool stuff in there. And then of course, EJ over at iDesign.com. He is, in my opinion, the godfather of Sketch and Tune. So if you like what I show you today and you want a deeper dive, make sure you check out EJ's tutorials if you haven't already. Before we dive into a fun Spider-Man model, let's go over the basic of Sketch and Tune and this really simple scene. If we jump into our material here, I like to build my Sketch and Tunes in the luminance. It makes everything really flat, but diving into Sketch and Tune module here, I'm only going to cover the cell and spots shaders, but if you want an in-depth overview, definitely check out iDesign.com. EJ's got a bunch of great tutorials. So let's get into cell shading. Now right off the bat, wait a minute, this doesn't look anything like I wanted. What's going on? That's because Cinema 4D's viewport doesn't really calculate Sketch and Tune accurately, so we're going to need to use the interactive render region. But luckily it's super quick. And briefly, to go over some render settings, if you hop into your options, we really don't need this, and if we're working with something with a lot of alpha channels, or like leaves or something with a lot of alpha channels that we're trying to look through, we might need to crank this up. But for now, let's just set all these to 2. That will really speed things up. And also anti-aliasing with Sketch and Tune, you can kind of see we're dealing with a lot of crisp lines, so we get some kind of rough edges. So to clean that up, first let's just set it to best. That's good enough for now. We'll have to crank those settings later when we're going to render. So let's close that and dive into the cell shader. So as you can see, when you orbit around, the highlight's still kind of facing you. It's facing the camera, and it's acting just like a Fresnel shader would. So if we dive in here, we can see all these checkboxes, and we have our gradient. So, if we kind of slide these around, we get a better picture of what's going on. So these control kind of the fall off of the gradient on our model, but right now it's facing the camera, which is not really what we want. We want more control over it. So we check on the lights, and right away it's already looking a little better. We have more control over where the highlights are falling, and it's much more art directable. Now one thing you'll notice, there's not really a shadow, so if we want to include shadows, just check the shadow box. But for now, let's leave that off. Now, there's some other things here. I'm not going to go over everything. Some of them are a little self-explanatory. So you use light color, so that will take into account the temperature or whatever color you're using in your light, as well as illumination. So illumination, this is a good one to go over. Before I go into illumination, I want to show you this gradient here. So if we drop down this and turn on some kind of simple linear interpolation, this looks really similar to a Fresnel shader that we were used to, but now it's controlled by the direction of the light source. One thing I like to do is, first of all, let's just simplify this, is I like to kind of, if I want that harsh shadow, I like to kind of pinch these really close by, but keep some interpolation, and that gives a nice little, if we zoom in, it gives a nice little softness wherever it's stretched out a lot. And I kind of like that. But for right now, to demonstrate the illumination checkbox, let's kind of stretch this out and even maybe put in some white. So illumination, by default, it's not really taking into account the intensity of our light source. So if I crank it down to 10, it stays the same. And if I crank it all the way to 1,000, it stays the same. Let's drop that back to 100. And if we turn on illumination, if I drop this down to, let's say, 50, what it's doing is it's really only calculating the first 50% of this gradient. And that's why we're not seeing any of these whites or highlights in there. It isn't until we drop that down to 50. Oh, we should start seeing it. Yep, we're starting to see it again. Now, this can be useful if you have multiple lights in your scene. Like if I have one up here and maybe I want a rim light. And you want the rim light to be brighter. Or, no, that looks a little weird. We want our normal light. But we want just a little bit on there. So that's really the only case I would use illumination. So for now, I'm just gonna keep it off. And that gives all of our control right here in the gradient, and we know what to expect. And it's just a little easier to control for demonstration purposes. Let's tighten that back up, and actually let's just make this grayscale. So that's nice and all, but I'm not really great with color. So instead of having to worry about, if we're doing a Spider-Man red, it helps to kind of have some color theory to know how to mix these. I'm not great with that. So what I like to do instead is work in layers and then just add a base color. Basically, it just becomes our shadow controller. And if that's too dark for us, we can drop that down to maybe 80. There we go. And that's a nice soft color. And then what we can do is we can start duplicating these. And I'm going to set this one to, actually let's set it to screen. And I only really want a highlight. So let's move our gradient up. And let's pinch that. And boom, there we go. Now we have a layer to control our highlights and our shadows. And the highlight's a little too bright, so let's bring that back. And that's the basics of Sketch and Tune, really. So let's take it up a notch. Let's delete these cell shaders. Now let me show you the spots shader. Now the spots shader, by default, you can already see, gives you spots. Wow, fancy that. Let's set that to multiply again. And if we hop into the spots shader, we see some familiar options down here with the checkboxes. So right away, we know we want to uncheck camera, check lights, and in this instance, let's use shadows. So these are a little big, so let's drop that down to about maybe 25% to start. That's looking good, but we can already see it's kind of wrapping around the UV mesh, and maybe that's what we want, but for right now, let's select our material tags and let's switch it to frontal, and that way it's always facing us. And you'll kind of see the aspect ratio is squashed, so we know our output is 16 by 9. So our ratio should be 16 by 9. And now let's bump that up to 100. And there we go. Now we have flat, perfect circles always facing the camera, no matter what your orientation is. All controlled with a light source. So let's take a look at what's going on here and what kind of controls we have. Now looking at, let's turn off shadow for right now and just focus on the diffuse. And we can assume from what we learned with the cell shader, this is basically doing the same thing. This is just going to clamp our gradient to be a little tighter, and now the fall off is different. And now you can see when we've got pure black here, it's a solid fill, and when we have pure white, we have nothing. So what we can do is clamp these values with, you know, like an 80%, and now we'll always have some dots. And let's stretch that gradient back out to give it a little more of a fall off in there. And maybe we don't want it to go completely black, so let's bring this up. And you can really play with it a lot to get your desired looks by clamping the black values and the white values, changing the scale, and that's good for now. So hopping back out, let's do what we did before. We'll duplicate that layer, set it to screen, and if we slide this up so we're just the highlights, cool. Well, that's not quite what we wanted. This is white subtracting red dots. What we really want is the opposite. We want to do the same thing as this, is we want white dots that kind of build up to white. So to do that, we got to swap our gap and spot color. Well, that's definitely not it. And that's because we need to swap this. And this might be a little counterintuitive, but you got to remember that this black value is telling us how much to clump it. So we're saying we want it just in the highlights where the light is hitting it. We want really dense dots. It's these that are controlling the color of the dots. So let's clamp this value down, because we don't want a ton of dots here. We want just a little bit. And let's have that fall off stretch out a little more. Hopping back out, let's try something different with our shadows. Now you see at the top here we have a shape, and if we drop it down we have circle, we've got diamond, checkers, lines, Now let's do some lines, but let's rotate it 45 degrees and let's make these real small. And once we get that small, we start to run in some problems with anti-aliasing, and this is when we're going to want to bump these settings up. And with playing around with it, the minimum level is definitely a lot more power to it. So let's start off with just 4.4 by 4.8. And even in the final render, we might even just want to go 8 in both values here. It's probably a little small, so let's bump that up to 50. And one thing, let's go back and turn on shadows, and we'll have to do that in both of them. Otherwise, if we don't, and let's say we only do it in the shadows, you're going to get the shadow overlaying on a highlight, so that's not quite right. So we want to make sure we're also blocking out the highlights and the shadows. So now that we got the basics down, I promised you we'd do some cool comic book stuff. So let's hop over here. I've got this Spider-Man character in a T-pose. I made my own suit for him, really simply in Illustrator. Using a screenshot, I just overlaid, because I knew I was going to do a front projection, and made my own super suit. Uploaded it to Mixamo and found this really cool, very Spider-Man-y action pose. Choose that frame. I've already got a camera set up here. That angle looks cool. We want to see some close-up so we can see some details. And he is just pure black and white. Pure black, pure white. Now we're going to need to start doing some stacking of these materials. So let's make a new one. Let's call it Shadows. I'm going to go through the motions as before. In Luminance, I'm going to add some spots. Well, first, let's actually add a background so we can see what we're doing. Cool, we got a cool gradient background. Let's work on our shadows. Now, if we're stacking these, and I'm going to do a front projection like before, and this canvas is a 1K square, so we don't have to worry about our UV dimensions. Let's drop it way down. And let's make it the lines. No. And let's turn down our render settings just a little bit. Speed this up. So really big. There we go. That's looking good. We want, oh, we need to add a light. Let's throw a light in our scene. We want it kind of from the top or into the side, because we really want some contrast kind of sweeping across the body. And this is what I mean by how art directable it is. Toon shading is all about your lighting. You got to have really good lighting for toon shading to look good. So that's nice. That's giving some nice contrast in the shadows there. Maybe a little too much, but we can control that later. Actually, let's control that right now. So let's maybe clamp that. There we go. Oh, but as you can see, right now it's just overwriting everything. And we can't multiply it because we're stacking materials. So we're going to need to use this same texture in the alpha channel. So what I like to do is using a really simple expression, set driver, set driven. There we go. Boom. And it creates this null with an expression. I'm just going to call this shadows alpha, so I don't hate myself later. And now we have a separate material overlaid on top of our whole material that is flat, so that way this can stay as a UV projection. And we can do the same thing for our highlights. But like before, let's do some circles. Swap these colors. Swap these colors. And let's throw it on top. That's too much. So let's clamp that highlight value. Yeah, maybe 30%. Just so we're only seeing a little bit of the highlight. There we go. Still maybe a little bit much. Maybe 50. Sometimes with the interactive render region, you need to change your camera view ever so slightly to get it to recalculate. It's a little annoying, but you get used to it. Those dots are a little small. Let's pump those up. We also might need to crank our anti-aliasing a bit. There we go. That's too big. Maybe it was just our anti-aliasing. That's looking good. And let's tighten up the lines a little bit and drag out the gradient. There we go. Getting a little more value change. It's looking good around the legs. The highlight's still a little bit much, but that might be our light source. It's a little better. That's looking good. So because the suit was originally just black and white, what we're really doing, we're only adding highlights to the black and shadows to the white. So that gives us a lot of definition and value. So it's not looking as flat, even though they're all flat colors. But I'd like to see a little bit more. So one thing we can do is add in some midtones. And we can do that straight in the black material. And because the black material is just flat black, we can keep it on frontal. And instead of using the cell shaders or the spot shader, I'm actually going to use the reflection. And we're going to use a specular material in here. So if we just turn on reflection, it's going to add, and see, this is a bit much, but one thing we can do is we can add a mask. So I've already downloaded one here, and if I show you really quick, I downloaded a carbon fiber texture from Shutterstock. So let's bring that in. Let's copy it to our texture path. And that will really, and that's really gonna make it a lot more subtle and pull it back. Now that's looking really good. And now our control is in the specular channel for how much and how bright it is. So if we crank it up, it's gonna be brighter. And if we do some fall off, we're gonna see more of it. But I want to keep this fairly subtle. Because we really just want to fill in a little bit of the black because there's a lot of black. There we go. So one more thing, if we want to get a little more value back in the whites and not have it be a completely flat object, we can simply, instead of using the luminance channel, we can use the color channel. And we're starting to get some of that shading back in. But that's a stylistic choice. You can do a lot of different look dev with a lot of these different techniques. So one thing we can do to the whites to bring in some of the midtones is instead of using the luminance channel, we can just use the color channel. And boom, right away we can kind of see it bring in some extra value. Now this is definitely a stylistic choice. Personally, I like using the luminance. I like that extra flatness. But these are all things that you will have to decide for yourself and your superhero. And one more option before we wrap this up. If we go to our sketch tags and add a sketch style, now this will drastically increase your render time, so do be aware of that. And you'll have to also turn on Sketch and Tune in your render settings. So one thing it's doing is it's kind of quantizing that shading. So maybe you like that look, maybe you don't. I do not like it, so I'm going to turn that off and turn the luminance back on so it's extra flat. There we go. That's looking pretty cool. And to finish up, let's just go ahead and change this to full 1080, which also means we're going to have to change our aspect ratio lines, which also means we're going to need to change the U and V values to match our aspect ratio. And I'm going to guess maybe around 35%. Oops. And let's get rid of that rotation. Let's kind of frame him a little better. There we go. That's looking really cool. Now, maybe I want his eyes to always be glowing, so let's bring his eye material to the front of the stack. There we go. That's looking cool. Now, real briefly, I won't go over everything. If you want to deep dive into this stuff, you should definitely check out some of EJ's tutorials. If we jump into this sketch material and hop down to thickness, can thicken these lines up a little bit. And let's actually reduce the threshold so we see a few more of them. Let's do maybe half a foot. Now, let's hop into our render settings one last time. Let's really crank our anti-aliasing settings for final render. And let's actually crank up our resolution too, because we want this big. And let's disable our interactive render region so we can save our computer. And I'm going to let this fast forward. Awesome. So that took 3 minutes and 30 seconds. That's not too bad for a 2K frame with all the effects we've got going on. And let's zoom in here to 100%. And look at all those layers in detail. And it's still very flat. All the patterns are flat. And close up, it looks pretty abstract. But zooming out, you really get a sense of all that value. And it's just really cool. I love this technique. So that's it. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. And I'd love to see anything you make. So shoot me a message on Instagram or Twitter. My handle is _UrbanPolarBear. And I'll see you next time.
Brograph.com, an online resource for learning Cinema 4D, After Effects, and other motion graphics tools specifically catered to help you prevail as a motion graphic designer.
What's up, bros? Welcome to another Brograph motion graphics tutorial.
With tutorials, plugins, and now a podcast with tens of thousands of listeners worldwide.
Yeah, it's a great community to be part of.
We give you professional time-saving tips, industry news, interviews, shortcuts, and lessons that help keep you current in the world of motion design.
Throw in the HDR studio, take the render settings, pick the HDR, put in a reflection, and gorgeous.
I love projects that scare me. When our art director comes to us and asks for something that I had never done before, man, it gets me pumped.
Our weekly long-form podcast will give you the latest news, help you in your file management, hardware configuration, and client relations. Learn about the latest render engines, modeling techniques, and workflow integration while staying entertained.
Real nice banana.
Ah, that's so funny. All right. I'm going to live forever.
Our Brograph talks are a chance to see the way industry leaders from around the globe are changing the face of motion design.
Sometimes you got to make stuff that you're not going to put on your reel, and I'm not here to judge.
The podcasts and talks include people like People, Barton Damer, Nick Campbell, Andrew Kramer, David Ariev, Chad Ashley, Paul Babb, EJ Hassenfrost, Mitch Myers, Chris Schmidt, Jules Urbach, Cornelius Dammert, David Brodeur, Andy Needham, Caitlin Kaju, Zubair Parker, Noseman, Ryan Bean, Casey Hupke, Nick Lyons, Sage, Joey Korenman, Jeremy Cox, Rick Barrett, John Dickinson, Matthias Omatola, Patrick Goski, Brandon Clements, Steve Teeple, Tom Glimpse, Patrick Longstream, Julia Simone, Devin Coe, Al Heck, and even Deadmau5.
You get that render done. Yeah, you better frame what?
Our Brograph breakdowns go behind the projects and give you an insight on what it's like to manage and maintain your own personal business or work for a large company. Join us for live sessions, check out our useful plugins, watch time-lapse projects, interact with us, and send us email questions and topic ideas. Or just hit the Rando Render button and do an imaginative daily that'll keep you on your toes.
Take all your dreams and let's do it!
Subscribe today and get automatic updates on the latest tutorials, tricks, tips, and inspiration brought to you by industry professionals Dave Koss and Matt Milstead.
We don't care how you get here, folks. Just get here.
Subscribe now to Brograph Tutorials.
It's pretty good, I guess.